Look around and notice something disturbing. People don't think anymore, they just repeat what they heard. They don't analyze anything, just copy ready-made opinions and regurgitate them as if they were their own conclusions. Mental laziness is already happening right in front of you, and the worst part is that it's disguised as progress. You think having access to so much information makes you smarter, but you're actually losing the ability to process anything. While you memorize catchy phrases, you forget how to structure real thought. Machiavelli already saw this happening in Italian courts 500 years ago. Aristotle warned about it in ancient Greece. Seneca noticed the same pattern in Rome. They discovered something fundamental. Real intelligence isn't about knowing more things, it's about thinking with mental filters that separate what matters from what's just noise. And today you're going to master exactly those filters before you become someone who just repeats what they hear. The difference between seeming confused and seeming brilliant isn't in the amount of information you process. It's in what you choose to eliminate. People who impress with intelligence aren't the ones who know more, they're the ones who filter better. They identify the essential, while others drown in irrelevant details. Machiavelli noticed this observing the advisors of the Republic of Florence between 1498 and 1512. He worked as secretary of the Second Chancery and saw educated men waste hours in meetings trying to impress with extensive analyses. They filled rooms with words, while crucial decisions remained buried under layers of useless information. The few who had real influence did things differently. They spoke less, but each word carried weight. They didn't compete to show knowledge, they just presented what changed the game. In his own works, Machiavelli followed this principle. The Prince is remarkably concise for a political treatise, getting straight to the point without academic fluff. But there's a brutal cost in not mastering this filter. You get stuck in a cycle where you accumulate information non-stop, but when you need to decide something important, you freeze. Your brain can't separate signal from noise, and while you hesitate trying to process everything, someone with superior mental clarity has already acted and won. The promise is simple. You'll learn the 3 filters these philosophers used to seem exceptionally intelligent, and each filter works immediately. But before mastering these mental shortcuts, you need to understand the mistake that's sabotaging your intelligence right now. You've already done this without realizing it. Someone asks a question in a meeting, and you feel that pressure to answer quickly to prove you're following along. Then it starts. You pour out everything you know about the subject, cite references, add context, explain every detail. 5 minutes later, you notice from the silence in the room, people aren't amazed, they're impatient. You confused volume with value. In Florence's political debates, Machiavelli watched diplomats lose negotiations because they wouldn't stop talking. In Greece, Aristotle saw thinkers get tangled in their own words trying to impress. In Rome, Seneca watched senators destroy proposals with speeches that never ended. What happens in your brain is simple. Defense mode activated. You want to prove value and choose volume as strategy. But that's intellectual suicide. Each extra word dilutes your message. Each unnecessary explanation weakens the argument. The more you talk, the more insecure you sound. 2 consequences appear quickly. First, nobody takes your ideas seriously anymore because they have to dig for what's valuable amid the excess. Second, people with less knowledge but more clarity dominate while you're still explaining. There's a way out, and it starts with something the true power strategists always did. Strategic intelligence begins with a skill nobody taught you. Observe before processing. Between 1502 and 1503, Machiavelli was sent on diplomatic missions to observe Cesare Borgia, one of the most powerful men in Italy. He wasn't just there to negotiate, he was there to study how power really worked. And he noticed something that completely changed his view on practical intelligence. The most influential people at Borgia's court weren't the ones who spoke most or knew most about history or philosophy. They were the ones who noticed details invisible to others. While common diplomats focused on words said during negotiations, the true strategists observed 3 specific things: micro-hesitations in speech, momentary shifts in gaze, and subtle changes in tone of voice. Machiavelli documented this in his reports to Florence. He described how Borgia would pause for half a second before answering certain questions, revealing where his real concern was, how his advisors would look away when certain topics came up, showing unverbalized discomfort or disagreement, how tone would change imperceptibly when they touched on subjects that really mattered. These micro-expressions happen because the human brain can't completely control automatic reactions. Before we formulate an elaborate response, our nervous system has already reacted, and that reaction escapes in minimal body signals. The trick Machiavelli systematized is simple: 3 seconds of pure observation before any response. When someone speaks to you, don't process the words immediately. Observe first what the body is saying. Notice if the person hesitated before stating something. See if the eyes fled when a certain topic was mentioned. Perceive if the tone got higher or lower at specific moments. These 3 seconds give you information that words hide. You begin to read the real intentions behind prepared speeches. And when you finally respond, your answer is already calibrated to the unspoken truth, not to the official version. People around notice you always seem to understand more than was explicitly communicated, that you catch nuances others miss, that you're always one step ahead in conversations. But knowing how to read invisible signals is just the first layer. There's another even more powerful Machiavellian technique about how to use this information without wasting your influence. Strategically intelligent people have a pattern you probably never noticed. They hold their best arguments. While everyone dumps their ideas at the start of conversations, the truly influential wait. They observe. They let others exhaust their positions first. Then, at the exact moment, they present the solution nobody else has. Machiavelli understood this deeply. When he wrote The Prince in 1513, during his forced exile, he had decades of observations about power and strategy. He could have written endless volumes, but did the opposite. He produced an extremely concise text. Each sentence carried maximum weight. His letters followed the same pattern. He was known for communicating in 10 lines what others took pages to explain. But it wasn't just brevity, it was economy of intellectual ammunition. He knew that premature argument loses strength. When you present your best idea too early, you give time for others to dismantle, question, dilute. But when you wait for the right moment, your contribution becomes the final word. The common mistake that destroys influence is participating in every discussion from the start. You feel you need to show you're following along, so you give opinions on every point raised. But each premature opinion spends your intellectual capital. People start to categorize you as just another voice in the noise. The technique is counterintuitive. Strategically silence while others debate. Let them present arguments, disagree with each other, explore different angles. You observe patterns, identify where everyone is agreeing and where they're stuck. Then, when the conversation starts going in circles and nobody has new exits, you present the solution you were already holding. This transforms you into someone who solves, not someone who just opines. People start to wait for your contribution because they know when you speak it's worth listening. Your previous silence created value for your later words, but mastering when to speak is only half the strategic equation. Aristotle discovered there's something even more fundamental: mastering how to structure what you're going to say to sound logically irrefutable. There's a brutal difference between giving an opinion and presenting an inevitable conclusion. Her opinion is something people can simply disagree with. Inevitable conclusion is something they can't refute without seeming irrational. Aristotle systematized this while developing formal logic at the Lyceum, the school he founded in Athens in 335 BC. Most philosophical debates were just exchanges of opinions. One philosopher would state something, another would disagree, and they'd spend hours on it without getting anywhere. But when someone presented an argument structured in cause and effect, the debate changed completely in nature. It was no longer about who shouted louder or who knew more ancient texts. It was about who connected premises to conclusions irrefutably. In the Analytics, Aristotle documented exactly this process. He showed the human brain is programmed to recognize causality patterns. When you just state your conclusion, people question. But when you show the logical chain leading to it, they follow the reasoning and accept. It's as if you're not giving your opinion, you're just revealing a truth that was already there. The process works with a simple 3-step structure. First, establish a premise everyone agrees with. Something obviously true nobody will contest. Second, connect that premise to a direct logical consequence. Use words like therefore or then to mark this causal connection. Third, present your conclusion as the inevitable result of this chain. Practical example: instead of saying we need to change our strategy, you structure it like this. Our results have fallen 3 months in a row. This happened in all regions where we kept the same approach, so the current strategy isn't working regardless of execution. See the difference? The conclusion seems inevitable because you built the logical path to it. People aren't agreeing with your opinion. They're recognizing a cause and effect pattern you revealed. When you master this structure, your ideas stop being questionable. They become conclusions any rational person would reach. You're no longer trying to convince anyone. You're just showing what's already obvious from the premises. But there are people who will try to destroy your reasoning using logical tricks disguised as arguments. And unless you know how to identify these traps, your perfect structure crumbles. Analytical intelligence has a defensive layer few master. It's not enough to structure your own arguments well. You need to recognize when someone is using false reasoning disguised as logic. Aristotle catalogued this in a work called Sophistical Refutations. He identified all the tricks that sophists, masters of Greek rhetoric, used to win debates without being right. The discovery was unsettling. Most people fall for these traps because they can't distinguish true argument from argument that just seems true. The pattern repeats in every discussion. Someone presents reasoning that sounds convincing in the moment. People agree and only later realize something was wrong there. But it was too late. The decision was made based on flawed logic. The 3 most devastating fallacies appear disguised constantly. The first is emotional appeal, masked as rational argument. Someone says something like, "Everyone who cares about this project will support this change." Seems logical, but it's pure manipulation. It's assuming that disagreeing means not caring, when actually it could mean having a different view of how to care for the project. The second is false dichotomy. Either we do this now or we'll fail completely. Presents 2 options as if they were the only possible ones, ignoring dozens of intermediate alternatives. The third is hasty generalization. Someone takes a specific case and transforms it into universal rule. We tried this approach once and it didn't work, so it will never work. A surgical technique exposes these fallacies without seeming aggressive. You don't attack the person, you question the argument structure with specific questions. For emotional appeal, ask, how exactly does this emotional connection validate the logical conclusion? For false dichotomy, but doesn't this assume these are the only possible options? For generalization, does this specific case represent all similar situations? The power of this skill isn't in humiliating who was wrong. It's in elevating the conversation's level. When you identify logical flaws with precision, you make clear you think on another level, that you don't accept any argument just because it sounds good, that your approval has value because it passed through your rigorous analytical filter. But there's an even more refined Aristotelian skill, transforming any confused debate into clear ground where only logic survives. Most debates get nowhere for a simple reason. People are discussing different things using the same words. Aristotle noticed this observing endless discussions at Plato's academy before founding his own school. 2 philosophers could debate justice for hours without agreeing on anything, simply because each had a different definition of the term in their head. One thought justice was absolute equality, the other thought it was giving each according to merit. Neither was wrong, but neither was talking about the same thing either. When Aristotle began systematizing knowledge in the categories and topics, he established a fundamental rule: never debate a concept without first defining exactly what that concept means. Seems obvious, but almost nobody does this. People assume everyone understands terms the same way. You say quality, your boss understands one thing, you understand another. Say urgent, your colleague interprets one deadline, you interpret another, and the conversation becomes a disaster of mismatched expectations. The move Aristotle used at the Lyceum was surgical. Before arguing about any topic, you establish the exact meaning of the central term, not generically but specifically and measurably. Instead of accepting, "We need to improve communication," you define first, "When I say communication here, I'm referring specifically to the time between a decision being made and all involved being informed. We are talking about reducing this from 3 days to 24 hours. See how this changes everything. Now each person can't interpret their own way anymore. The ground became clear. Either you're talking about this specific definition or you're talking about something else. When you do this, sterile debates die instantly. Because 90% of discussions are about different meanings, not opposing ideas. You take control of the conversation's framing. People need to adjust to your precise definition or propose another equally clear one. But they can't stay in the comfortable ambiguity where each interprets as they want. Who defines the terms controls the debate's limits, and when your definition is surgical, you force everyone around to operate at your level of precision or be exposed as vague. But even with perfect logic and precise definitions, you might be asking the wrong questions. And Aristotle discovered that who controls the questions controls where the conversation will end. Questions have more power than statements. That's a truth few truly understand. When you state something, people can simply disagree, and that's it. But when you ask the right question, you force the other's brain to work on the premises you chose. Aristotle learned this studying his teacher Plato's method, who in turn had documented how Socrates used questions to dismantle absolute certainties. Socrates never told people they were wrong. He just asked questions that revealed contradictions in their own reasoning, and they arrived alone at the conclusion they needed to rethink their positions. Aristotle refined this technique in the Topics, where he systematized types of dialectical questions. He noticed certain questions force the interlocutor to examine their own foundations. They're not questions to obtain information. They're questions to test an argument's solidity. The structure is always the same. You question premises, not conclusions. Instead of saying your strategy is wrong, you ask, what makes you conclude this strategy will work in this specific context? The person then needs to make the reasoning explicit, and by making it explicit, often realizes the flaws themselves. Another devastating type of Aristotelian question challenges applicability. Does this apply in all situations, or only in specific cases? If only in specific cases, which ones exactly? Suddenly, that absolute statement that seemed solid starts to crumble. The person realizes they were generalizing something that only works under particular conditions. The most powerful thing about this is you don't need to have all the answers. You just need to ask the questions that expose where the other's reasoning is weak. And curiously, this makes you seem smarter than if you presented your own solutions, because it demonstrates your thinking at deeper levels, that you don't accept superficial arguments, that your mind questions foundations others simply assume. Aristotle used this constantly in Lyceum debates. His students presented theses, and he tested them with questions, not to humiliate anyone but to strengthen reasoning. Who survived Aristotelian questioning left with truly solid arguments. But perfect logic serves no purpose if you lose mental clarity when pressure increases. And Seneca discovered something crucial about maintaining functional intelligence exactly in the moments when you need it most. Seneca spent years living under constant threat of death. He was exiled on political accusations, then returned as advisor to Nero, an extremely unstable emperor who eventually ordered his suicide in 65 AD. In that environment of extreme pressure, he couldn't afford to react emotionally. He needed to keep his mind clear when everyone around panicked. In Letters to Lucilius, he develops a fundamental principle: create distance between feeling and reacting, not repressing emotions, but observing them before being dominated by them. Emotional reaction clouds reasoning. When something irritates or scares you, your brain enters survival mode. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for analytical thinking, gets partially shut down. You react automatically with anger, fear, or defense. And these reactions are rarely intelligent. The shortcut is direct. When something pressures you, observe what's happening in your body before responding. Notice if your face is heating up, if your muscles are tense, if your breathing got fast. Just observe without judging. This simple observation already creates separation between you and the emotion. You're not the anger, you're with anger. You're not the fear, you're with fear. In this microscopic separation lives your freedom to choose the intelligent response. While others react instantly and later regret, you respond with precision. Your clarity under pressure becomes your signature, but maintaining mental clarity is just the first step. There's an even more powerful filter: knowing how to instantly distinguish what deserves your mental energy from what should be completely ignored. Have you noticed how intelligent people seem to have time for everything, while you're always overloaded? It's not that they have more hours in the day, it's that they apply a mental filter that eliminates most of what consumes your attention. Seneca understood this deeply. During his years of exile, He could have wasted energy lamenting injustice, planning revenge, ruminating about what he lost. But in letters from that period, he reports focusing only on what was under his absolute control: his thoughts, his studies, his philosophy. Everything outside that simply didn't deserve mental energy. When he returned as advisor, he applied the same principle to Roman court intrigues. There were dozens of small disputes, endless gossip. Seneca ignored almost everything. He focused exclusively on the few decisions that really impacted his position and safety. It's fascinating because centuries later, in 1896, an Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto mathematically discovered this pattern. 20% of efforts generate 80% of results. But Seneca already practiced this principle without needing statistics. He observed his own life and noticed depth in few essential things generated more results than dispersion across many. In letters to Lucilius, he constantly returns to the same fundamental themes: how to deal with death, how to maintain virtue under pressure, how to distinguish essential from irrelevant, not because he had little to say, but because he knew focused repetition builds true wisdom. The filter works like this. Every time something demands your attention, instantly ask, is this under my control or not? If it is, you decide whether to act based on real impact. If it's not, you eliminate it from your mind completely. No discussion, no rumination, no wasted energy. When you apply this consistently, something extraordinary happens. You stop reacting to everything and start acting only on what generates real results. Your intelligence stops being scattered and becomes concentrated. It becomes clear you don't get distracted by small problems, that you have clarity about priorities, that your mind is calibrated to the essential. But there's a final layer of Stoic intelligence that brings it all together, transforming any complex situation into crystalline binary decision. Complexity paralyzes. The more options you consider, the harder it becomes to decide anything. Seneca saw this destroy people constantly. Roman politicians lost in endless analyses while problems worsened. Merchants stuck trying to predict all possible variables before acting. Philosophers who complicated everything so much, they never reached practical conclusions. Seneca's genius was in reduction. He took complex philosophical questions others debated for decades and transformed them into something immediately applicable. When Lucilius, his friend, wrote long letters full of doubts about how to live well, Seneca responded with cutting clarity. He didn't create new levels of complexity, he did the opposite. He found the central question hidden under all others. In letters to Lucilius, he explains this principle repeatedly. Most people get confused because they try to solve 10 problems at once, but usually there's a root problem. If you solve that one, the other 9 disappear on their own or become irrelevant. The shortcut is devastating in simplicity. Facing any complex situation, ask, if I could solve only one thing here, what would it be? This question forces your brain to prioritize, to identify what really matters versus what's just noise around the central problem. Practical example. You're in a meeting where 20 different questions came up about a project. Someone wants to discuss budget, another wants to talk deadlines, some people worried about team, others about technology. The conversation becomes chaos because everyone's right about their concerns, but then you apply Stoic reduction. If we solve only one thing now, what would it be? Suddenly, everyone realizes the real problem is lack of clarity about the project's final objective. All other questions depend on this. Solving that first makes everything else easier. Seneca applied this in his own writing. His letters are short, direct, focused on one principle at a time. While other philosophers wrote treatises hundreds of pages long exploring every possible angle of a question, Seneca went to the center. One letter, one principle, immediate application. When you master this reduction to the essential, you become the one who brings order to chaos. Meetings spinning in circles gain direction when you identify the central point. Confused discussions resolve when you reveal what the decision that needs to be made really is. Your intelligence isn't in processing everything. It's in knowing what to ignore to focus on what solves. And this brings us to the final transformation point. Now you're no longer someone trying to accumulate knowledge desperately. You've become someone who applies mental filters that separate essential from irrelevant. You've mastered something few understand. Real intelligence isn't about how much you know, It's about how you process what matters. Machiavelli taught you to observe invisible signals before reacting and to save your best arguments for the decisive moment. Aristotle showed you how to structure thought in cause and effect, detect fallacies in others' arguments, define terms with surgical precision, and ask questions that expose weak foundations. Seneca revealed how to create mental pauses under pressure, filter 80% of what consumes others' attention, and reduce any complexity to clear binary decisions. These aren't isolated tricks, they're integrated mental filters that transform how you think. You left the position of anxious information accumulator and moved to the position of strategic processor. The difference is brutal. Before, you tried to absorb everything and got overloaded. Now you filter automatically, maintain clarity, and act with precision. The transition milestone happened when you realized you can trust your ability to identify the essential without needing to know everything. 3 patterns now operate automatically in you. First, you observe 3 seconds before processing information. Second, you connect everything in cause and effect before concluding. Third, you instantly ask, "Is this under my control?" before spending mental energy. What no longer fits in you is that anxiety to prove intelligence all the time, because you don't need to prove anything anymore. Your clarity speaks for you. There's a simple ritual that consolidates all this. Before any important response, mentally ask, "Is this essential?" A 2-second pause, a 3-word question. But each time you do this, you're activating all the filters you learned. You're choosing clarity instead of reactivity. Now you've seen how these 3 philosophers transform common intelligence into strategic clarity. But there's much more that Machiavelli, Aristotle, and Seneca discovered about mastering any situation. Click the video on the screen now to continue learning the secrets few know.